No game in the past couple of years had me as hyped as the Resident Evil 4 remake. After playing it, I genuinely think that this should be the blueprint for how remakes should be done. The original game that came out in 2005 is still in my top 5 games of all time, and I don't think that anything will ever push it out of that top 5. There were certain story embellishments and elaborations in this remake though, which made certain things make sense, so to speak. So in this video we'll be looking at how the Resident Evil 4 remake expanded on the lore around the game, as well as looking at the expanded backstories of some of the characters in the game. Now this is version 2 of this video. The previous one, which I've now unlisted, will contain everything that one did, only this one will expand on what we've learned from the Separate Ways DLC, and will hopefully fill in anything that I missed in my original video. Separate Ways rounded off this remake perfectly in my opinion. It explained one glaring plot hole from the original, which I'm very glad that they clarified. If you want to know the story for the original, then I've already made a video on that one, so if you haven't already, go and check it out. I do have to mention that although the story in this remake has the same overall outcome as in the original, there will be spoilers in this video for Resident Evil 4, so you have been warned. But let's dive in. So as you may know, this story takes place 6 years after the T-Virus outbreak occurred in Raccoon City, of which the guilty party was a big bad corporation named the Umbrella Corporation. As you also know, Leon Kennedy, at the time a rookie cop, was headed to Raccoon City to start his very first shift at the Raccoon Police Department. Leon came across Claire Redfield, also headed to the city to track down her brother Chris, and they soon found the city overrun with flesh-eating, hungry zombies. Long story short, Leon, Claire and a young girl named Sherry Birkin escaped an Umbrella laboratory underneath the Raccoon Police Department, whilst Raccoon City itself was reduced to ashes with a thermobaric missile under the orders of the President of the US, and Raccoon City was cordoned off and kept out of view from the rest of the world. Umbrella then essentially collapsed. Now here is where our first story difference comes into play. In the original game, Leon started working for the United States government shortly afterwards, a special team called United States Strategic Command, US Stratcom for short. This team were under the direct orders of the President. Leon was part of a team that was responsible for preventing the use of bioorganic weapons, amongst other responsibilities. In the remake, however, Leon goes a little further in explaining what exactly happened to him after the Raccoon incident. Leon explains that he was asked to join a top-secret government program, but it's clear that Leon was essentially forced into the program, as he said that he had no choice, likely because of what he knew about the Raccoon City incident and subsequently Raccoon City's sterilization. The US government likely wanted to keep Leon close. In addition to this, Leon was also forced into US Stratcom because Sherry Birkin was essentially taken into custody by the US government and was the subject of research. In exchange for her safety, Leon would serve the US government as an agent. So, Leon began his training. It was, as he puts it, punishing. Leon trained under Major Jack Krauser, and he says that although the training almost killed him, it helped him take his mind off of what happened in Raccoon City. It seems that Leon was, understandably, deeply affected by what happened in 1998. Nonetheless, Leon did manage to complete his training. He then went on a few missions, one of them with Jack Krauser, but we'll get to that a bit later. This explains and I guess ties off the question of how Leon got so proficient in combat and turned from rookie cop into a super badass. When it comes to Luis, his role in the remake is a little different. As we saw in the original, we didn't know him for long, as he was killed by Lord Sadler in the castle. This time round, Luis was killed by Krauser. Due to his death being different, Luis got more screen time. Instead of being gagged and locked in a wardrobe, he was bundled into a sack, tied up and thrown underneath the house, leading to Leon finding him and untying him. As he did in the original, he meets with Ada at some point, and this leads to yet another expansion on the storyline. She asks about something called the Amber, but again that's something we'll be diving into later in the video. In the original, Luis lied to Leon about his background and stated that he used to be a cop in Madrid before he left the force. Luis was saying this to cover up the fact that he had a degree in biology and that he worked for Los Illuminados in their research department. He was the one who discovered the genetic mutations that the Plaga parasite could achieve. Then we find out that Luis became disillusioned with his work and what Lord Sadler was making him do, so he contacted an organisation for which Albert Wesker was working and agreed to steal a dominant species Plaga for them. Sadler found out, and that's why Luis was detained, and that's why Ada was sent by Wesker to Spain. We did end up learning something about Luis's childhood in the original, that he was familiar with the area as he used to go hunting in the forest with his grandfather, but the remake expanded on this a little bit more. Luis did still go hunting with his grandfather, but the truth is that Luis actually lived there in the village. It gets expanded upon further when Leon finds Luis's grandfather's journal, which Luis kept on him. His grandfather had high hopes for him, but says that Luis is stuck there in the village. But then we find out that Luis's grandfather died after being attacked by what he called a wolf. His grandfather would then start to deteriorate, hearing voices, and he noticed that his body would move on its own. He'd been infected with the Plaga parasite. The chief of the village at the time, whilst Luis was absent, in an attempt to contain what they considered to be a madness, set Luis's grandfather's home on fire, and after the death of his grandfather, Luis finally left the village and obtained his degree in biology, and then got noticed and started working for Umbrella. More specifically, Umbrella's European Research Division, Laboratory 6. This particular lab was mentioned in the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis game. Anyway, Luis would start working on and researching a parasitic species called the Nemesis Alpha. Yep, Luis was on the team that had a hand in creating this guy. Nemesis came from implanting a Nemesis Alpha parasite into a T-103 clone. This parasite was also responsible for the mutation of Lisa Trevor from Resident Evil 1. Luis would then soon become disillusioned with his work for Umbrella and would return to Valdolobos and started working for Los Illuminados. Luis in the original was annoyingly vague. He'd start to tell Leon and Ashley something and then he'd just leave. We know he was kind of working alongside Ada. In the remake, however, Luis is a lot more open. He's clearly showing his guilt. He not only shows them he was implanted with a Plaga parasite, but he also shows them proof as well. A scar on his chest showing the successful removal of a parasite from his own body. The remake also goes deeper and shows us that it was the Los Illuminados head researcher Annabel Escudero who became devoted to Osman Sadler at one point and had all the senior researchers implanted with a Plaga parasite, which of course included Luis himself. This culminated in Luis stealing a dominant species Plaga parasite and contacting an organization. But there's more to the particular Plaga he stole, along with what Sadler intended to do with it, and again, we'll get to that soon. Now we get on to Chief Mendez, the Big Cheese. In the original, Chief Mendez was by all accounts exactly as we saw him. A mean, seemingly invincible, absolutely massive angry dude. But in the remake there's a lot more to him. We now get to understand exactly why he was so furious. It appears that prior to Mendez becoming the village chief, this guy was the chief, and Mendez was in training, I guess. This man could have been Chief Mendez's father, judging from this photograph in Mendez's attic, but that's just speculation. I'm not sure whether Mendez became the village chief due to the passing of this man, but nonetheless, Mendez was entrusted with the village. The village itself was a very traditional village, and a lot of the villagers were themselves devout Catholics. Mendez was very involved in the village and he kept a record of what happened there. In the remake, we can find 3 documents which give us a good look into Mendez. It seems that before he became the angry man we see in both games, beneath it all he was actually a good person. In Volume 1 of Mendez's village records, we can see that he speaks to a young boy who lives in the cabin by the lake with his grandfather. No prizes for guessing who he's talking about. Luis. Mendez mentions that Luis's mother died in childbirth. Young Luis would even speak to Mendez and tell him stories, and it turns out they knew each other very well. Now here's where the crossover happens. Luis's grandfather gets attacked by the wolf and fears of a madness descend upon the village. Before his grandfather's death, Mendez was told by the grandfather that he knows what to do if anything happens. Luis's grandfather eventually died, and it was actually Chief Mendez who had the cabin set alight, containing the madness, so to speak. Mendez remarked that Luis turned up and didn't say a word. He didn't move a muscle, and then Luis left the village, and this led to him obtaining his degree in biology, along with him joining the Umbrella research team. Anyway, with the madness contained somewhat, the villagers would carry on as usual. This tight-knit community would celebrate little successes in making their lives that little bit easier. You see, this was a village that shunned modern technology for a more traditional lifestyle. A couple of successes under Chief Mendez saw them finding a way to catch more fish, as well as opening up the ironworks, which allowed for the creation and manufacture of agricultural tools needed for farming. They built a fish farm, and all was going well in the village under the leadership of Torres Mendez, who was teaching the children of the village literacy and mathematics, and then by the evening he was dining with the families in order to hear their grievances. The secluded, very private village was opened up to the outside, and the village was by all accounts prospering. But then along came Los Illuminados. Before we continue to look at the downfall of the village of Valdolobos, we'll look at some differences the remake uncovered about this strange and deranged parasite worshipping cult. It seems that the cultists we see in the remake are a lot different than the bumbling mindless drones we see in the original. For a start, they are far more brutal. There are some differences this time round too. The red-robed zealots seem to possess the ability to call upon the Plaga to literally awaken and erupt from its host on request. Now, going back to Chief Mendez's second volume of the Village Records, we can see here that Mendez wrote about a strange group of black-robed people entering into the village, and they raised their flag with a spider-type insignia on it, preaching about salvation and forgiveness. They then injected the villagers with something they claimed would cure the villagers of madness. Then, as detailed in the third volume of Mendez's Village Records, we can see that the villagers had completely changed. The farming and the agricultural responsibilities were being neglected, and the cows, not being fed, were growing thin. Less workers meant no crops were being harvested, and the villagers started starving. But their loyalty and devotion to their new lord Osman Sadler did not wane. By the winter, 30 villagers had died from starvation, so 5 cows were slaughtered. Lots were cast and 6 villagers were chosen for Lord Sadler, and this number only increased over the coming weeks. We see that the cult has been responsible for many disappearances, judging by this room here, which houses a lot of skulls. This room, the town hall, was actually where they kept El Gigante before he grew too big. In the intro sequence, we see that 2 hikers were captured by the cultists and sacrificed. The police officers reference them at the start of the game, and then Leon comes across these 2 hikers later in the game. This explains how the villagers in fact became mad, and how Mendez's character shifted more into the realm of the psychotic. Of course, it may have seemed that Los Illuminados came out of nowhere, but in fact they had been operating on a nearby island where they had not only been researching and adapting an ancient parasitic organism, but had also built up a large militia on said island. At this point, Luis had started working for Los Illuminados and had helped researchers discover mutations of the parasite, creatures such as El Gigante, the Regenerators, and U3. In the original, it was explained that the Plaga parasite was sealed away in a mine underneath the Spanish noble Salazar family's castle for centuries, after the Salazar family fought a long battle against the cult, preventing them from trying to gain control of the parasites. Although this all changed when Lord Osman Sadler came along. Also in the original, we are told from a butler's memo that Salazar, a young impressionable man thought to be around 20 years old, was influenced by Sadler into opening up the mines again after telling the young nobleman about the sins of his family, and they started excavating, using the villagers as miners. The cult found that the parasites appeared dead, but further examination revealed that they were still showing signs of life at a molecular level and were producing spores. However, the damage was done to the miners, who started to show signs of changing after they'd inhaled the spores from the parasites. A document by the mining foreman shows us what happened. The villagers of course became ganados, literally translated as cattle, but the overall lore on Los Illuminados' background was expanded on quite a bit, so here goes. The biggest question on people's minds was, where on earth did Osman Sadler come from? He had literally no backstory in the original. Well, we now have an answer. Lord Sadler's ancestors went back quite a long way, and they shared the same fervour for Las Plagas. Hester, Keenan, and Adam Sadler were just a few. They wrote the Los Illuminados Bible, if you like, which talked of praising the holy insects, and that they had been promised paradise on Earth. They left behind epitaphs which give us even more backstory on Los Illuminados. According to this epitaph from Adam Sadler, on which the Roman numerals translate to the year 1554, it was here that Adam found his faith, pretty much confirming that this was the start of the cult and the discovery of the Plaga parasite. Just under 200 years later, in 1741, another Sadler explained how the cult had been expelled from the mainland by the militant wicked. This is obviously talking about the Salazars and how the mines had been sealed up by the Salazar family, which in the cult's eyes was a massive sin. One thing we do see in regard to Lord Sadler himself is that 1, he's not a cheesy goofball anymore, and 2, he seems to be a lot more powerful. In the original, Sadler would seem to only be able to control people that were in his general vicinity, potentially through his staff, and due to him having a dominant species Plaga, he could force them to obey him. It's the same case as the original, but now, Sadler seems to be able to affect sufferers from a distance, almost like a hive mind. He also seems to be able to speak through Ashley to Leon. What's more is that he's able to force Leon to suffer pretty vivid hallucinations. Also, he's got a pretty funky head this time, as well as a few very strange followers that accompany him everywhere. So in my Resident Evil 4 story video on the original story, we looked at the origins of Las Plagas. In another video on the story of Resident Evil 0, 1, 2 and 3, we also looked at the origins of Umbrella. In that video we looked at what Chris and Sheva found in West Africa in Resident Evil 5, a flower containing an RNA virus which itself would go on to be developed into the progenitor virus. The progenitor virus would be the basis for the T-virus, which of course led to the outbreak in Raccoon City. Anyway, in Resident Evil 5 it was found that the flowers discovered in West Africa dated all the way to the Neolithic era, a period of time during the Stone Age. A tribe would consume the flowers and would exhibit superhuman strength and mutant-like abilities. Wall murals in Resident Evil 5 in an underground city depict the tribe worshipping a purplish organism along with fossilized Plaga parasites. It's still not explained how and when these parasites ended up in Spain, but we did find out a little more about the Plagas now that the remake is out. Also, in one of the rooms we can find a drawing on the wall which may depict the same flowers from West Africa. Before, in the original, Leon went through the mines and that was pretty much it. Nothing to scream and shout about, but the remake almost took my breath away when entering into this section here, the insect hive. And this tells us so much. Let's revisit what the final chapter of the Illuminados Bible stated about the holy insects. It seems that the insects were very central to the worship by the cultists. They believed that these insects were holy, that they were themselves capable of infecting victims with the Plaga parasite. But the most important discovery was an amber deposit which was sat in a storeroom collecting dust. Luis writes about the fossil inside the amber, and he states that inside this amber was a fossil that contained the same organ that they found inside the dominant species of Plaga that was inside Saddler. But the difference is that this particular Plaga, when fully developed, may surpass even Saddler's power. This amber would then be the Plaga sample that Luis stole from Los Illuminados. As was explained in the original as well, Luis soon realised that Saddler's plan was much more of a political leaning though, much more than the apparent worship of bugs and parasitic organisms. He wanted to topple the US government from within, and he found the perfect tool to aid him in that mission. The amber was slightly further elaborated on in separate ways through research journals. In research report number 12, the amber was said to have great influence over other parasites and even strengthens them, optimizing the relationship between the parasite and the host. This researcher wanted to test the amber out on superior species of Plaga, but, as previously mentioned, only the ones at the top of Los Illuminados, like Saddler, are host to superior parasites, and it's extremely likely that none of them would volunteer for the research. In research report 14, the researcher was successful in seeing if the amber reacted to a superior Plaga. They mentioned that they should fear the power sleeping within the amber, and that they should prepare for it awakening. One particular moment in separate ways that I really liked, the feature of a brand new creature dubbed Martinico. Martinico, a once deformed individual, was a test subject that evolved and regenerated to the point that conventional weapons did absolutely nothing to it. This was due to the amber. It seems that they really were right to fear the amber. The only thing that could destroy Martinico were powerful lasers. That's right, the DLC brought back the laser hallway, and it was good fun. In the original game, Leon meets Krauser and they have a knife fight on the island. Krauser explains that Leon probably heard that he died in a crash 2 years prior in 2002. This is obviously not the case. Krauser also explains during the fight that he wants the sample that Saddler developed, and that he needed Ashley in order to buy Saddler's trust in him. It's clear that Leon and Krauser knew each other, but in the original we didn't really know how until 2009's Darkside Chronicles. Some of you familiar with Resident Evil lore will recall that in Darkside Chronicles, Leon is sent by the US government to search for a drug lord in South America called Javier Hidalgo, who has been working alongside Umbrella in the sale of BOWs. Major Krauser went with Leon, but he was jealous of Leon's mission coming directly from the US president himself. Krauser grew even more resentful of Leon as time went on, and Krauser didn't even believe in the existence of BOWs at all. Krauser went on to get wounded by Hidalgo's BOW mutated wife Hilda, which essentially put an end to his ambitions in regard to his career. Anyway, it's revealed that Hidalgo strengthened himself with the use of BOWs, and Krauser not only understood why Hidalgo did this, but he also sympathized with him too. In Krauser's own words, the darkness awoke deep inside him. Krauser then reached out to Wesker, who was working for a mysterious organization, and Krauser was sent to Spain to infiltrate Los Illuminados and retrieve a dominant Plagas sample. He soon learned of Sadler's aim to infiltrate the US government through the Plagas. In an attempt to gain Sadler's trust, Krauser kidnapped Ashley Graham while she was travelling home from university despite her having a guard detail, what with her being the president's daughter and all. In the original, that's pretty much all we're told about the abduction and Krauser's connection to Leon, and we were left to work the rest out. But as with the theme of this video, the remake expands further. We've discussed that Krauser trained Leon, and that Leon got sent on missions, although the intro to the game doesn't say what missions exactly. In the remake, a case file reveals that Operation Javier went a bit differently and it's potentially confused things. According to the case file, Operation Javier was top secret. So top secret that not even high ranks of the US government were aware of it. Knowledge of this operation was quite simply buried due to the inhumanity surrounding it. But the remake tells us this about Operation Javier. Essentially, a small unit of elite special forces soldiers was sent to eradicate the drug cartels in South America. But in the case file, it's revealed that the entire unit was wiped out, but for one soldier, Jack Krauser. But it gets worse. The unit wasn't wiped out by the cartels, but instead by their own government. Signs pointed to a potential power struggle within the US government, which led them to not extract the unit. Then, after the deaths of the soldiers, the government covered everything up. Jack Krauser was therefore considered dead. A note on the case file left by Krauser indicates that the document in question was written by an American journalist, and judging by the second note, the journalist has been taken care of and the document seized by Krauser. There's not really any mention of Leon going with Krauser on Operation Javier though, and this could be because Leon was a government agent and technically he was never there. When it came to Ashley's abduction, we already knew that Krauser wasn't working alone. This was a meticulously planned abduction from within Ashley Graham's security detail, the Secret Service. Separate Ways tells us that a special antenna was installed on Los Illuminados island facility, which allowed them to effectively intercept and spy on communications, making it easier for them to kidnap Ashley. What we did learn was that Ashley would be transferred onto a cargo ship and then transported and delivered to Los Illuminados in Spain. This gave us a wider look into exactly why Leon was the only one in contention for this mission. He was the only one that was cleared of any wrongdoing inside the president's staff, as everyone else was under investigation. So yeah, we learned a bit more about Krauser, but the Operation Javier thing kind of threw a spanner in the works. Krauser, in the original at least, seemed to be desperate to gain Sadler's trust. His hatred for the US government caused him to completely defect to Los Illuminados, and given that Krauser wants strength and power, he figured that the Plaga can give him that. His failure to retrieve a sample of the virus prompted Ada to be sent to Spain to retrieve it herself. Krauser and Ada would speak at points in the original, but none of these interactions took place in the remake. Again, a document in Separate Ways gave us more insight into Krauser's motive. Going back to Research Report 14, the researcher mentions that the test subject they used in order to see if the amber reacted to a superior Plaga sample was Jack Krauser himself. The researcher described the other potential test subjects as too suspicious, but Krauser was eager for power, or in the words of the researcher, Krauser had a lust for power. It didn't take much to convince him. They described Krauser as one of the most powerful people they've ever seen. Krauser also had a minor change to his role in the remake, as he was the one who collected Ashley from Ramon Salazar and took her to the island, as opposed to some of Salazar's men taking her there in the original. Speaking of Salazar, let's look at him next. To start with, you may have noticed a new addition to the waterhall within the castle. A volatile black liquid erupting from the pools which wasn't present in the original. There's a note in the game which states that this strange black liquid, it doesn't appear to have anything to do with the mold in RE7 and 8, acts as a stimulant for the Plaga which speeds up, or rather at least guarantees, that the parasite will assimilate successfully with the host. We also see this liquid being force-fed to Ashley in the castle throne room. It could, however, be linked to Resident Evil 5 and the Ouroboros project. So let's take a look at what changes we've seen when it comes to the 8th Castellan Ramon Salazar. In the original, it seemed, at least from the butler's notes, that poor Ramon was a young man who simply got influenced by Osman Sadler and guilt-tripped into redeeming himself for the sins of his family. We may have thought, was Ramon always this depraved? Well, in the remake, we get a little more of a glimpse into what Ramon was actually like. A note by the housekeeper states that they have failed. This seems to indicate that Ramon's father, Diego, the 7th Castellan, before he passed on, was concerned about his son and his rather unstable mind, so he entrusted the housekeeper to keep Ramon from the path of wickedness. His housekeeper goes on to state that during Ramon's younger years, a servant uttered "Pulgasito" behind his back, which essentially means that they were making fun of his height. He then doused the servant's face with some vitriol, which is essentially sulfuric acid, and then he watched in glee as the servant writhed around in agony on the floor. The housekeeper still blamed the cult for influencing Ramon into removing the seal, keeping Las Plagas locked away. Separate Ways also gave us another cool piece of lore in regard to this section, the waterway, underneath the castle. According to the Salazar family chronology, it was built by an architect, Count Gregorio. It was built in order to contain deadly insects. It goes on to state that water itself is a symbol of purity for the Salazar family. Anyway, the waterway was sealed until it was rediscovered during excavations, likely during the time they were mining for the fossilized Plaga parasites. Of course, Ramon was only interested in the waterway for drowning the people who opposed him. Classic Salazar. Another cool change and an expansion to the lore is an explanation as to what on earth the two servants he has to his right and left are. In the original game, we see these two. Leon fights one, and the other gets assimilated into Ramon's monstrous mutated form. One of Ramon's servants, a man named Isidro Uriarte Talavera, was tasked by Ramon to improve the flaws of the human form, to seek perfection as observed in arthropods, essentially creatures which are invertebrates, i.e. no skeleton or backbone, and instead have a hard exoskeleton. 2 years later, Isidro found a way to transfuse this black liquid into the body. Some prisoners thrown into a cave underneath the castle were thirsty and drank the liquid, leading to complete madness. But another 2 years later and success, Isidro discovered a new species and named it U2, a sacred larva which would be carried and developed in the wombs of the Chosen. This species was named the Novistador, and they were the annoying flying insects. Another 2 years later, Isidro fused together human and insect. The housekeeper volunteered herself for this experiment. And 1 year later, out was born one of the two bodyguards of Ramon. Isidro named this one Passanta. Passanta would wear a black cloak, but then he decided 2 is better than 1. The other would come as a result of Isidro volunteering himself for the same experiment to prove his loyalty to his master, and he became the other bodyguard, Verdugo, and would wear a red cloak. These two would be known as the Verdugos, literally translated as executioner, and these became the designation U3. It was great that Capcom expanded upon these two creatures and where they came from, but we got more than that with the DLC though. In the original, Leon fights one of Ramon's bodyguards, Verdugo, and defeats it. Then, when Leon confronts Ramon Salazar in the final castle section, the second bodyguard, Passanta, fuses with Ramon and the Queen Plaga. In the remake, Leon fights the first bodyguard as normal, the Verdugo, but the second bodyguard, Passanta, is no longer present. This was elaborated on in the remake as Ada is being constantly pursued by Passanta. This culminates in an encounter underneath the castle where Passanta is now revealed to be U3. In the original, U3 was the enemy that Leon faced on the island instead. Changing this to an arena battle for both phases of the fight instead of the suspended rigs section was a great decision. Finally, one of the creepiest, most tense encounters in the original was Blind Wolverine in the prison, the Garrador. We encounter him again in the remake, but this time in a much creepier setting, in the darkness of the castle dungeons. A note in the remake tells us more about this individual. According to the castle caretaker, he used to be the Salazar's torturer. It was a generational thing. His father and grandfather served as that before him in the very same capacity. The caretaker states that he harbors enough hatred inside him to ruin the world. He was allegedly gifted at tormenting others. It's not clear exactly why Ramon Salazar had the man locked away and blinded in the dungeon, but unfortunately it fell upon the caretaker to feed and care for him. The caretaker then, driven mad by the screams coming from the man, simply left the castle, or rather he tried to. It's a small bit of lore, but it was awesome to find out a little bit more about him. Okay, so in the original we see that Ada was sent to Spain in order to retrieve the sample that Krauser failed to get. She was also ordered by Wesker to kill Leon if he becomes a threat to their goals. Ada's side of the campaign in Valdalobos was seen through the expansion called Separate Ways. This campaign wasn't included in the remake at first, but in a small teaser of what was to come, Leon said this.
I think we both know this. It's where we go our separate ways.
At the beginning of Separate Ways in the original game, Ada's mission was simply to ring the church bell in order to save Leon. This time round though, Ada was in the castle. She was disguised as a cultist and had to free Luis from captivity. This is also the first time she encounters the black-cloaked bodyguard Passanta. Luis and Ada get separated and agree to meet at the church in the village. Ada this time round gets infected whilst fighting Passanta, and she immediately begins to feel the effects of the infection. The creature appears to be able to influence Ada's mind. Nonetheless, Ada brushes Passanta off and makes it to the village and to the church, helping Leon out by ringing the church bell. Other differences in Separate Ways we've not yet mentioned in comparison to the original were the following. Ada repeatedly faced Passanta in the castle, the village, and underneath the castle. After saving Leon from Chief Mendez and watching him leave, Ada is attacked and chased by Mendez and a load of ganados. The second El Gigante section, cut from Leon's campaign, now features as an independent fight in Ada's campaign. There's an added section in the castle because due to Ada being infected, as well as Leon and Ashley, Luis needs certain ingredients in order to be able to craft a suppressant. Ada no longer fights Jack Krauser at any point, while she did in the original, which makes sense, since in the original, Krauser was working for the same organisation as Wesker and Ada. The gondola section, which was removed from Leon's campaign, was included in Ada's campaign instead. Ada's fight with Sadler is in a different location this time round. The original is in a lab, and this time round it's in the ruins. One major difference this time round, however, is that Wesker actually turns up in person. He's nearby. At the end of the original game, when Ada boards a chopper and leaves the island with a sample, she has two. She swaps the dominant Plagas sample with a subordinate one. She delivers the subordinate one to Wesker, forcing him to go to the island and retrieve a sample from the corpse of Jack Krauser. Now this, in the original at least, made little sense to me, that Wesker would be able to go to an island that has been completely destroyed and obtain a sample. Anyway, in the remake, Ada only has one sample, the real one, and she has a little chat with Wesker, asking him what he plans to do with the sample, and this is how that conversation goes.
I've obtained the amber.
Excellent.
Just one question. What are you planning to do with this?
We do not pay you to ask questions. All you need to know is a new dawn is breaking. 100 will give their lives so that just one may live. I am expediting that change.
So, we're talking millions of casualties.
Billions.
How ambitious.
Did you notice anything on the screens? Excellagione of Tricell and the Stairway to the Sunflowers in West Africa. And this game obviously leads into Resident Evil 5 and the creation of the Ouroboros project. I have a video on Resident Evil 5 story if you want to check that out too. In this scene though, Ada holds the chopper pilot hostage and instead diverts the chopper to somewhere else. Given that Wesker was planning to betray the mysterious organisation he and Ada were working for, it's likely that Ada informed her employees about Wesker's deception, leading to him leaving that organisation and working alongside Excella and Ricardo Irving in Africa. Separate Ways went even further post-credits, and it solved the question of how Wesker got the sample from Krauser's body. As Ada is escaping via chopper, a ship is seen. This was a ship operated by the company that Ada and Wesker were working for. This explains how Wesker was able to get to the island so quickly, because he was in the area. Him being present on the island at times explains the mystery of how he got the Krauser sample. He simply waited for Leon to defeat Krauser in combat and collected his corpse. Crafty. But it was clear from their conversations and their body language during their face-to-face meetings that Wesker didn't trust Ada, so him waiting for the power-hungry Krauser to get himself killed was his backup plan. Finally, as a little bonus, we'll look at some more cool, minor changes shown in the game which make no difference to the storyline. The first is the one at the start, where the officer takes a leak, in line with the original, but this time the officer gets drawn into the forest to investigate a noise, leading to his inevitable demise at the hands of the villagers and Del Lago. And as we see in the original, the police officers instead get taken off screen after their car is rammed off a cliff. The developers played a mean trick on you in making you think that the dog or wolf was killed, but then they surprise you later on and let you save it. Another cool difference was the completely unexpected blowing up of the bell tower. The removal of the gondola section from the original meant that Mendez's eyeball wasn't needed as a key item in Leon's campaign, so it could simply be sold for cash to the merchant. The original troll encounter with the chain doors was removed in favour of a narrow area with regular enemies. The Del Lago Lake section was much more enjoyable this time around with various side areas. The Ashley section was more enjoyable. Gone was that horrific sliding puzzle, which instead got replaced with something a lot less rage-inducing. As well as that, the section with El Gigante, instead of him just bursting into the area, we find out that he was actually dormant, but that the Plaga inside him was awoken by a red-robed zealot. Another thing which I thought was an awesome touch was the parasites attaching themselves to the cultists and literally controlling them like puppets. Also, when you killed a Ganado or a cultist, you could see their insides moving. Pretty grim. They replaced the original's running away from the Salazar statue section and incorporated it into this section from the original by adding the statue as a fire hazard. My absolute favourite reworked section of the remake though was the minecart section. There was just something super hilarious about seeing Dr. Salvador holding a chainsaw and staring at you whilst riding a minecart. Unfortunately, this section led to the death of Luis by Jack Krauser this time, instead of his original demise at the freaky tentacle belonging to Sadler, although I am grateful he got extra screen time in the remake. Speaking of Krauser, the knife fight was awesome this time. Instead of a QTE sequence, we got an actual fight. Then before Luis actually dies, he is the one who saves Leon from being killed by Krauser, instead of Ada in the original. The Ashley section where she was driving the truck was gone, thank the Lord, and it was replaced by a wrecking ball section where Leon had to protect her from lots of enemies. And then there was the minor difference where Ashley was taken in the original by the Novistador, whereas in the remake she was taken by one of the Verdugos. But anyway, that's it for this video. I hope this did a good job of explaining what the remake and the DLC expanded on in terms of the lore surrounding what is, and will always be one of my all-time favourite games. If you enjoyed this updated video, then please leave a like on it and subscribe if you aren't already. But for now, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.